Hello, G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about metamodernism, primarily through the lens of the work of Greg Dember and Linda, and what they do on metamodernism. Greg Dember has a wonderful book, Say Hello to Metamodernism, and I really enjoyed speaking with him about the book. It was really quite lovely. And Dember describes metamodern. He says, metamodernism refers to works of art, literature, film, music, philosophy, and other aspects of culture that engage the conflicts between modernist conviction and postmodern relativism by embodying an aesthetic that braids together those different perspectives with an emphasis on felt experience or interiority. And Greg in the book introduces a fantastic metaphor that I really enjoyed, braiding, that goes with oscillation, but the braiding language I think really clicked a lot for me. Because a good artist is going to be braiding together modernist and postmodernist elements in such a way that you can't completely categorize what the work is. You're not entirely sure. And in that ambiguity, the interiority and the felt experience of the characters comes through, and it really comes out. I'll say more on that in the review on Say Hello to Metamodernism. Here, I wanted to discuss some sort of speculative ideas that, for me, I've been thinking about after reading Dember's book. And to start, I find it very interesting David Foster Wallace, who is certainly associated with metamodernism and his ideas of a new sincerity, pointing to what had to come after postmodernity. This idea of the kind of the sincere individual and genuine and earnest, and how this was kind of a rebellion against postmodern irony, deconstruction, and things like that. But I agree with Dember on the idea that Wallace was more like a literary Moses figure, leading the way through the desert to the postmodern, but unable himself to truly cross over into such a mentality. Dember is making the point that although Wallace saw the need for metamodernism, he himself did not move into meta-modernism in the ways that Dember describes. What I find very interesting is I do think there are scenes in, say, Infinite Jest expressing or suggesting the importance of interiority. We have Don, I believe, at the end, Gaiety at the end, who is refusing pain medication because he doesn't want to relapse. And there's also this idea that there's a certain defense of feeling, even if it's pain, even if it's a wound, because that is his, and no one can take that, even if it's a pain. Makes me think of some of the ideas from In Strange Woods by Esposito and Matt and Ryback on this idea that the pain doesn't go away, but it's the pain is good, kind of as Hal talks about, it's yours. And there are also just continual ideas in Infinite Jest that are suggesting some sort of choosing to feel in light of the temptation of consumerism, or obviously the infinitely entertaining video that the governments are fighting for, etc., so forth. But I think Dember is correct that Infinite Jest never it stays in the postmodern. It doesn't cross over into metamodernity. What I find very interesting is I do think in The Pale King there might be an effort of Wallace to indeed cross over into a defense of interiority. But he's primarily doing so through boredom. I think there are metamodern elements. Dember will talk about autofiction, where the author is breaking through the text and there's a certain confusion between the literary character and the writer of the text, and it's not sure which is which. And there are moments of that in The Pale King where, say, Wallace will come out and say, Wallace here, author here, no, not a cheap gimmick, the real author. I love that. That's really fantastic. And there are some other elements in The Pale King of metamodernism. But what really interests me is this idea that comes up later in the novel on the true hero is bored. They're doing this IRS work, this auditing, this return, and they're doing it day by day. And there's this kind of idea in this extreme state of boredom can, in fact, something heroic emerge. And I can't help but associate that with some sort of saving of the human, some sort of interiority that is being preserved and that comes out in the state of boredom. And it does seem to me that Wallace, to try to go beyond postmodernity and the entertainment industry that it brought, looks to boredom as a possibility for moving on, post-modernity, we might say. But I'm not sure if it works. I don't think boredom works in this way, but of course the question becomes why. And I think Dember's emphasis on interiority as a key facet of what needs to happen in a metamodern work where interiority comes out can help us understand why boredom does not lead to postmodernity. Because boredom, as someone like Patricia Sachs in her book on the literary history of boredom shows, boredom is not merely a state where there's nothing to do, which actually that can be a place of daydreaming and exploration, as Ebert talks about, but it's where you've come to kind of existentially see no significance in what you could do. And this is kind of the rub. The problem with boredom is that it actually numbs the interiority. Yes, there's a loss of distractions from interiority. There's a loss of external influences that take you away from yourself. But unfortunately, it's a state where even if interiority has a Heideggerian clearing to come out, and I do strongly associate clearing with the state that metamodernity achieves, to have interiority comes out. But the point is this: boredom is where interiority is numbed, and so it doesn't come out, even though it is there, which suggests why boredom is not going to be the road. But I bring this up because I think the very fact that David Foster Wallace does not move into metamodernity suggests that Greg Dember is correct to emphasize the interiority which modernity and postmodernity are being braided together to make a clearing for it to come out, to come forth. And another way to put this to help make the point is I have been thinking about the way that Greg Dember describes metamodernity in terms of Alex Ebert's freak theory, which I love and find myself using all the time, is the idea that if you have a work that introduces postmodern irony, the author then brings about earnestness to counter that irony so that the audience is not sure if the work is postmodern or not. And then if it goes toward a kind of totalizing vision of rationality, there's then an introduction of postmodern irony to undermine that rationality. So like, oh, well, maybe this isn't a modernist work or a traditional work. And it keeps fluctuating back and forth, back and forth. And that fluctuation makes me think of the wavelength that Alex Ebert describes in freak theory. And eventually the wave back and forth oscillation becomes so intense, both in there's structural oscillation and hermeneutic oscillation in metamodernism, as Dember puts it. But regardless, and together even, both of those oscillations intensify to the point where the wavelength compresses and it becomes tight and it begins to look like a solid red block, as Ebert will show in his presentations. And that's when you can't even tell there's a wavelength. It seems like there's no wavelength at all. There's a point of, as Ebert puts it, total saturation. And in that total saturation, you can have a phase transition where something can emerge out of it. Now, the word emerge means many things to many people, and people would not like a conflation of phase transition and emergence, so I should note that. But the idea is that at a certain point of saturation, of an acceleration of the wave, you get a new phenomenon, you get a new qualia, a new quality comes out in the experience of the wavelength. Now it looks like a red block or something. Well, I like this a lot because I think a successful metamodern work, in fact, intensifies the relationship and braiding and weaving together and oscillation of the postmodern and modern elements to the point where you get like a phase transition, exactly like Ebert says, which we can think of as a clearing in which being comes forth in a Heideggerian sense. But here what comes forth is interiority, the emotional state. When you can't categorize the work as postmodern or modern, then you're led to ask, well, what can I know is certain? What can I know with certain? And what you can know is for certain is the emotional experience you're having watching the work, or the emotional transformation of the characters that happen. An example could be like the movie Don't Look Up, which you have them sitting around the table at the end, having a dinner before the apocalypse, and there's this real emotional moment that occurs there. And that would be metamodernity, leading to that deep interiority that has used postmodernity and modernity together to lead to this point, to have this felt experience. That you can, I can't know if my thoughts are real, but I can know if I really felt something. And so that emphasis on the feeling that successfully comes out when an artist well designs the relationship between modernity and postmodernity in the work, earnestness, irony, etc., 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 is the metamodern move. And I think it is extremely important because that can help us understand why the Pale King, through boredom, does not work into transitioning into metamodernity, because it numbs the possibility of an emotional interiority that a metamodern work must necessarily arise to through its operations. Another way to think about this is the metamodern braiding and oscillation in the freak theory. It creates a kind of apophatic nothingness, this kind of fullness, which I would call lack. Jockin has made the point that lack is when the light is so excessive I have to close my eyes. So it's a blindness from an excess of light, which is very different from the blindness that results from losing a function where my eye doesn't work, right? Both are blindness, but they're very, very different. One is an excess, the other is an absence. And critically, lack is not nothing. And the oscillation that leads to the wave structure in the way we've described Ebert is an excess. It's not an absence, it's an excess of oscillation that eventually leads to a new quality. And I think excess leads to basically a Heideggerian clearing, which is apophatic. It's a nothing that results from fullness, not a nothing that results from absence. And you see, boredom is a kind of nothing, but it's a nothing of absence. And that's why it doesn't generate a new emotional felt experience. Whereas oscillation, in the way that a metamodern work works, actually is more like a lack. We lack the ability to categorize if the work is modern or postmodern. We're not able to conceptualize it, but precisely that inability to conceptualize it is why we then hone in on the felt emotional experience that comes through. And, that I think really helps crack the case, if you will, on why the Pale King does not move into metamodernity, which has, I think, for me, always been a kind of mystery. And I appreciate Dember's work to help us understand that. So I think felt interiority is very, very, very important. I think the idea of that felt interiority being thanks to a excess and braiding and weaving of postmodernity and modernity in the metamodern work is extremely important, because when there's such an excess of elements that we can't categorize it, we home in on the thing we can know, which is the emotional experience that, the artist. Well, and I think Dember put it very well when we spoke. The artist is communicating to the reader or the watcher, whoever, that I also am in this place where I don't know what to think. I also, too, am confused by all of the things going on in the world today. But I do know this experience, this emotional experience, is real. And that's what I'm going to focus on. And there's a certain solidarity that the viewer can have in that experience that I think is extremely, extremely powerful. And so I think that emphasis on interiority that Dember brings to the table is extremely important. For more of Greg Dember's work, please read his book, Say Hello to Metamodernism. You can find his links and videos. He has wonderful YouTube conversations on metamodernism on his YouTube channel that I'll put in the description. And thank you so much for your time.